The housing market looks different in 2025. You have more inventory, you have homes sitting on the market longer, and you have more price cuts. But despite all the changes, there's one thing that hasn't changed, and that's sellers still offering buyers agents compensation. So in today's video, we're going to talk about why that matters more than ever if you're considering selling your home in 2025. But before we do that, let's take some time and actually talk about what has changed in the market and why it's important for sellers to know this when it comes to negotiating things like buyers agents commissions. The very first thing is you do have more inventory, which means buyers now have more options out there. Over the last couple of years, when sellers were listing their homes, many times they might have been the only listing in a neighborhood, which at the time meant if a buyer wanted to buy in that neighborhood, then that property might have been their only option. But the biggest difference now is sellers no longer have that leverage in many markets out there. And one reason for that is there's just less buyer demand out there at the moment. You've got interest rates staying higher for longer, on top of housing affordability sitting at really, really low levels, which has pushed a lot of active buyers to the sidelines waiting on something to break, either home prices to come down, interest rates to improve, or something that makes that home way more affordable. And if that weren't enough, we're now in the summer market, which means seasonality is now having its play. And this is a slower time in the market than the spring. So as this trend continues and we move into that fall winter market, you're going to have even less buyer demand out there, which is going to continue to push negotiations in favor of buyers. The other thing we're seeing is days on the market add up. Homes are now sitting on the market longer than they were just a couple of weeks ago, than a couple of months ago. And not only is this causing sellers to panic out there in the market because their home is no longer selling the very first weekend, like they saw on HGTV, or in some cases, maybe their agent told them it would. Now you also have agents starting to panic because a lot of the agents out there in today's market have never been in a market where homes sit on the market, where things don't sell in just a couple of days or a couple of weeks. We're now in a market where things are sitting on the market for weeks, months, and depending on your price point, maybe sometimes years, which is the main reason we're seeing about 41% of homes out there on the market having some sort of price cut. And that's because those sellers that are serious about selling their homes are having to cut prices in order to compete in today's market. Maybe their neighbor down the street has a similar property that's now listed for less than their home, and maybe in some cases it's nicer. Well, what's that seller to do other than lower their price in order to compete in today's market? Now, some sellers will say, screw it. I've got equity in my home. I have a super low interest rate. I'm just going to pull my home off the market and sell it at a later time. But for some sellers, that's not really an option. Maybe they've already purchased another property, or maybe they're in escrow on another property and they need the cash from their existing home in order to purchase that home. Well, guess what? They now have to do things in order to compete in that market. And that's because there are more listings out there. Buyers can now shop around. If they don't like your home or like the terms that you're offering, guess what? They can just say, screw it. We'll go down the street and try to make an offer on that property. And that's one of the key messages I want you to take away from today's video, is that you are in a market today where you as a seller have to negotiate, right? The price is no longer the only thing you're negotiating. You're now negotiating the terms of the contract, which over the last couple of years have been really in favor of you, the seller. But now that we've had this shift in the market, things are moving more in favor of buyers, which in order to make it a win-win for both sides, there has to be some negotiation. So let's take a minute here and talk about why buyer agent compensation matters, why this negotiation is very, very important for you as a seller. But before we do that, I'd like to take a minute and ask a favor. If you find any value in my videos at all, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up. And if you want to stay updated on everything about how to sell your home for top dollar in the quickest amount of time and get the highest return on your investment, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. The reality is offering buyer agent compensation can actually expand your buyer pool, especially when it comes to first-time home buyers who can't afford to pay this out of pocket. And here's the thing, a lot of buyers out there are actually expecting you, the seller, to pay the buyer's agent compensation because of the conversation they're having with their agent to start. And that's because of one of the things that was implemented as part of this whole policy change that is now required in order to show a buyer a property. There now has to be a buyer's representation broker agreement signed that goes over compensation. And part of that conversation with me as somebody who represents both buyers and sellers, when I sit down with a buyer, we talk about compensation. We talk about what I as an agent want to be paid, what I expect to be paid for my services. And we talk about how that is actually paid. And one way it can be paid is the buyer can come in directly with that money. But as we know, a lot of first-time home buyers only have the money for the down payment. They might only have the money for the closing costs. They don't have the additional money to pay that 1 to 2 to 3% compensation depending on what that agent's charging, which leads me into the next way that compensation can be paid. We can say, hey, listen, you don't have the funds to pay me directly. So one thing we can do is we can actually ask the seller to pay that compensation. Now, with that said, we talk about it being a negotiation. And even though I charge this, the seller can come back and negotiate a lesser amount. And then there's also circumstances where the seller might pay part of it. You as a buyer might pay part of it. But either way, it's a conversation we now have to have. In fact, those terms need to be signed on that document before I can ever show a buyer a property. And here's the thing. The reality is the sellers who aren't willing to negotiate, aren't willing to offer some sort of compensation, concessions in today's market, whether it be towards commissions or whether it be towards closing costs or buying down the rate. If you're not offering that in today's market and your home is just sitting on the market and you're not doing anything in order to sell it, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. Because remember, you're not just selling your home, you're competing against every single home in your price range, in your geographical area. Now, I know what you're all thinking. Well, I thought that whole lawsuit was supposed to remove commissions, where sellers no longer had to pay it, prices were going to come down, and things were going to adjust where the buyer had to pay that compensation. Well, that was the theory behind the idea. And us as agents that had a lot of experience over those years, I've been doing this over 20 years, we basically said, what seller is now just going to reduce their price by the compensation that they're no longer paying and allow prices to come down? That's not how it works. In fact, sellers want to maximize their price. They're basing their price off other comparable sales in their market. So they're not going to take a haircut just because they're offering less compensation. That seller still wants to maximize the price, the time, the terms, all of those things. And here's the thing, that NAR lawsuit did remove compensation from the MLS. So us as agents representing buyers, we go in and look at a property that a buyer has sent us. We no longer see whether or not that seller is paying compensation. Sometimes they mention, yes, the seller's willing to pay compensation, but even if they do mention that, it doesn't say the amount, at least when you're looking at it initially. But what does happen is when a property is sold, what we're required to do as agents is put in if there were any concessions on those properties. And one of those concession line items is, did you pay any broker agent compensation? And what I'm seeing 9 times out of 10, when I go back and look through these sold properties and I'm looking at comparables for other clients when we're trying to figure out the value of a home, we're saying, look, this seller paid compensation, this seller paid compensation. All of these sellers around you, when they sold their home, they paid compensation. And I'm not the only one seeing that. In fact, study after study, including a recent report from the Federal Reserve, shows that these changes have had no measurable effect on commission rates. And you're probably going, how? Why? And that's because the market still rewards cooperation. And the reason for that is sellers are choosing to offer cooperation because it helps them sell. It helps them compete against their neighbors. It helps them get the top price in their market when they're negotiating terms. Imagine you are a seller selling your home and your neighbor selling your home, and you both have the same floor plan, maybe the same upgrades. Maybe you both bought them just a couple of years ago and you got the builder grade. So everything is exactly the same, the location, everything. And you're putting them on the market at the same price. But your neighbor is willing to offer compensation or concessions to any buyer's agent coming in, and you're not. Well, who do you think that buyer is going to go with? The buyer is going to go with the property that requires less money out of pocket in most cases. Now, before I talk about the psychology of selling in today's market, I want to talk about what the Federal Reserve actually found in that study. One thing that they noted was commissions had dropped from an average of 3% in the 90s to around 2.7% in 2023. At the same time, they noted that 3% is still the most common compensation bar across the nation. But here's what I'll say. In my market, we haven't really seen 3% buyer's agent compensation in some times. Yes, you can ask for it. Yes, you do negotiate it. But one thing I'll say is that most buyer's agent compensation, at least during my 20-year career, has been somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. But since the recent study, what I've seen is I've actually seen compensation come down. It's more negotiable now than it's ever been. In fact, I'm telling sellers when we're negotiating the terms of the contract is try to negotiate that compensation down and just see how the agent responds. Even though they have that 2.5% agreement with their client in this case, maybe they're willing to take 2%. So let's negotiate it down to 2% and see what they come back with. Because what I'll tell you is oftentimes I'm representing buyers and we have an agreement for, say, 2.5%, just making up numbers here. And we put that in to the seller. And then the seller comes back and says, hey, we're not willing to pay you 2.5%. We're willing to pay you 2%. Well, then I go, you know what? let's go with 2%. We're getting the deal accepted. You're happy with the terms. Let's just move on. I don't want this to be the sticking point in the negotiation, because at the end of the day, I want my clients to be happy. I want them to refer me. I want them to have a good experience. In fact, I want them to come back to me when they want to sell their house and buy something else. So I'm willing to work with them in that case. Now, in theory, in that negotiation, the buyer's still on the hook for the 0.5% because they signed that agreement at 2.5% that we just mentioned, and we accepted 2 from the seller. So the buyer is actually responsible for that 2.5%. Now that becomes a negotiation between me and the buyer. Do I want the buyer to still pay that 0.5% negotiation? Or am I willing to just say, the hell with it, I'm willing to take 2 so that we all move on? And that's hard for me to say exactly what happens. Now, in my case, many times I'm willing to just let it fly. I'm willing to have that negotiation with my client, say, you know what, it's not worth you paying the additional 0.5% to do this. Let's just move on as the terms. Now, each agent's going to approach it differently. Some agents want the full compensation that you've agreed on. Others are willing to negotiate. But one thing I'm seeing is a lot of negotiations happen. So if you're a seller out there, you should at least try this negotiation and see what the buyers respond with. Are they willing to accept it? Is it a sticking point with the agent, or is it a sticking point with the buyer? That's ultimately for them to decide. But the reality is, you as a seller should try to negotiate it. Now, one thing the study did note is that lower commission listings actually stay on the market longer. They're also less likely to sell, and they're also less likely to receive cooperation from other agents. One thing as a seller that you're trying to do in negotiation is get the buyer's agent to come on your side of the table, right? They're in theory representing the buyer, or they are representing the buyer, and say, I'm representing you as the seller. Well, one thing we want to do in negotiation is make that buyer's agent happy. We want them to feel like they're getting a good deal so that when tough negotiations happen, they feel like they're part of our team. They feel like they're getting compensated fairly so that they can help negotiate with their client. That's our goal as agents representing sellers, is to help everybody feel like they're winning. But the key thing I want you to take away from what the Federal Reserve found is that policy changes didn't really move the needle, and that there's been no statistical impact from buyer representation agreements or from any sort of commission rebate ban. It hasn't really had a material impact on what's happening in today's market. And the main reason for that is because sellers are still willing to offer compensation, not because they have to, but because they want to. They want that leverage. They want that agent on the other side to feel like they're getting compensated fairly, because if they don't and negotiations get tough, then they might just tell their client, hey, let's move on. Let's move to that house down the street that is offering the full compensation, or hey, maybe that house is better, or what have you. But on the flip side, if they feel like they're getting treated fairly by our negotiation, they're more likely to stay here and keep their client here. And the other thing that a lot of sellers have realized is it's easier to adjust and negotiate terms than wait on the perfect buyer that's willing to pay their own compensation. Why wouldn't you just work with somebody already willing to make an offer on your property? One thing I've learned in 20 years, over 20 years of experience in this business, is that your first offer is usually the best offer that you're going to receive on that property in all terms. Now, that's not always the case, but what I can tell you more often than not, your first offer coming in typically has the best terms for your client. So if you are a seller, there's some things out there that you need to know. Compensation is a tool. You have to use it strategically in your negotiation. Now, with that said, you don't have to set an offer percentage in advance. You don't need to put it as part of the listing agreement. In fact, you don't even need to tell your agent that you're willing to offer compensation. Just let offers come in and see what they're included, and then make that part of negotiation. Now, when I'm representing a seller, I don't put in the MLS that you're willing to offer compensation as a seller. And the reason for that is I don't want to set the precedent that that's the case. In fact, I have agents call me all the time. Is your seller willing to offer compensation? Put it in the offer, right? I don't want to set the precedent that, hey, we're willing to do this, because maybe there's a buyer out there that was already planning on paying it themselves. We don't want them to now come in and ask you to pay it if they were going to pay it. So there's no need to set the precedent up front that you're willing to pay it. Just know in your head that it's something that's likely to come up. Now, with that, one thing I often ask buyers to do is I say, put yourself in the shoes of the seller. Sellers, put yourself in the shoe of a buyer. Most of the time when somebody is selling a home, you as a seller, you're also buying something on the other side. So if you're covering somebody's compensation when you're selling a home, guess what? Now that you're a buyer, and you go out, put an offer on a property, chances are you can also ask the seller to pay your compensation, right? Now, on the flip side, if you're somebody saying, no, I'm not paying any compensation as a seller, the buyer needs to pay their own. Well, guess what? Now you're a buyer. Do you want to pay that compensation yourself? Maybe you do, but in most cases you don't, right? You want the seller to pay that compensation. You want a fair and reasonable negotiation. So before you sign any listing agreements, ask your listing agent how they handle compensation. Did they put it on the MLS? What do they do when someone asks them if compensation is being paid? On top of that, you can ask them what's happening locally. Like when they show you listings in your market and they start telling you, hey, this is what your home is worth based on the homes here that have sold and whatever, see what those homes sold for, see what compensation was included, because that should all play in to how you list your home. And I'll say one of the key things to take away on top of what we discussed earlier is just flexibility, being willing to negotiate. Don't agree to paying compensation up front without some sort of negotiation in the process, right? Wait to see what comes in and then decide how you're going to negotiate. It's not a one-size-fits-all agreement, right? You might be willing to pay somebody more compensation on one deal than you are on another deal based on their offer price, based on their terms. That's ultimately for you to decide. So what I'll say is while the rules have changed, consumer behavior has not. Agent behavior really hasn't changed either. And because of that, smart sellers are still offering compensation because it works, because it helps them stand out, because it helps them compete against their neighbor, and because it also ends up getting them the best terms and netting them the most money. Now that doesn't mean you have to overpay, but you do need to be able to compete. Now, if you're a seller out there and you want help navigating this process, you're looking for a real estate agent that can guide you that has experience like me, well, if you'd like to work with me and my team or get referred to an agent like me anywhere in the United States, make sure you check that link below. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier in the video is the housing market has changed. It has shifted. So with that, there are some things that you have to shift in your mindset as a seller, which I cover in this video right here.